Briefly, I'll tell you, Radley is a senior writer and investigative reporter for the Huffington Post, where he covers civil liberties and the criminal justice system. He writes about music and culture in Nashville, Tennessee, where he lives as well. He's a former senior editor for Reason magazine, where his weekly column and investigative features were finalists for and won a number of journalism awards. His 2009 investigative report on expert witness fraud in a Louisiana death penalty case won the Western Publication Association's Maggie Award for reporting. In 2011, The Week named Balko a finalist for Opinion Columnist of the Year, and the LA Press Club named him Journalist of the Year. His work has actually been cited by the United States Supreme Court in Hudson versus Michigan, and cited and excerpted by the Mississippi State Supreme Court as well. His extensive reporting on controversial Mississippi medical examiner Stephen Haim helped win a new trial and an acquittal for a 13-year-old murder suspect, Tyler Edmonds, and eventually to Haim's termination. His new book, Rise of the Warrior Cop, The Militarization of America's Police Forces, has won widespread praise, including from The Economist, The New Yorker, Wall Street Journal, Publishers Weekly, and the New York Journal of Books. Briefly, Balko's book deals with one of the most important but often ignored amendments of the United States Constitution, and that's the Third Amendment. And he goes into great detail in his book about the Third Amendment and what he refers to as a symbolic Third Amendment. In America, we've taken great pride and there are certain institutional safeguards in the fact that our civilian and military authorities are distinct and operate within distinct spheres. Balko, in his book, mentions how that line between civilian and military and between soldier and police officer is steadily blurring. And it endangers our liberties as citizens and is something that we should all be concerned about. In fact, the Alabama Constitution, Article 1, Section 28, the Declaration of Rights, which was from 1901, but actually dates back to Alabama's statehood in 1819, has a strong preference for an institutional safeguard, as I mentioned, against housing, quartering of soldiers in homes. And once again, and Balko mentions this, that's one of the purpose behind this particular, and it's also mentioned in our Third Amendment to the United States Constitution. The reason, or the impetus or reason behind those particular provisions is that to protect civilians and to protect our liberties and to keep the military out of domestic affairs. The Third Amendment to the United States Constitution is often called the Forgotten Amendment. There's been no United States Supreme Court directly on point that's ever addressed it. Several of the circuits, including the Second Circuit and 10th Circuit, have addressed it. And the Griswold United States Supreme Court briefly referenced it, but there's been no real adjudication of it, probably because of the language is so clear. In fact, because of that, and it's never been really cited, as I said, as a main authority or really challenged, it's often been deemed anachronistic and forgotten. Many of you may have heard recently of this Blue Ribbon Constitutional Revision Commission, which formed by Alabama Senate joint resolution. It created this constitutional commission, and it consists of, among other people, the governor, the Speaker of the House, the President pro temp of the Senate. And they were been tasked, this committee, with going article by article through and making recommendations to the legislature to change or fix Alabama's perceived, in many instances, broken and anachronistic constitution. One of the most important changes that they recommended, and almost not many people even challenged it or were really concerned about it, but they dealt with Article 1, Section 28. And that's the provision of, like I said, it's been in Alabama's Constitution in one way or another since 1819, when we first became a state, that no soldiers shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. And that, as I said, is a constitutional, not only in the federal Constitution, but in the state of Alabama. And it really dates back, and Balko talks about this, to 1689 and the English Bill of Rights. And it's been there that long. It's almost become ingrained. It has become ingrained in our nation's psyche, and it's part of the American spirit that the civil authorities be able to be separate and apart from the military. And this really evidences the founders' aversion to an internal standing army. And the symbolic Third Amendment, which Balko would talk about tonight, a prohibition on peacetime quartering, but it really is a more robust expression of the threat of standing armies posed to societies. And that's what this Section 28 has really embodies. But the most remarkable thing is that this commission recommended that provision be deleted from the Alabama Constitution. Their comments to that and the recommendation that the grounds for that reason, the grounds for the deletion was that this prohibition, which grew out of complaints of the colonists against King George III, may now be anachronistic. I think that's quite a remarkable recommendation by this commission, and none of the citizens seem to be concerned about it at all. And I would strongly encourage many of you to look at New Orleans during Katrina to see this constitution, the primacy of this constitutional provision, where state troopers and military personnel entered people's homes without warrants, without probable cause, in many instances unlawfully, to seize firearms. And especially in where we are now, I can see that definitely becoming an issue during times of emergency, which seems to be far too often under our governors, especially during times of storms or perceived crises. Radley also talked about some of the most important safeguards, the Castle Doctrine, and no-knock raids, and the rise of SWAT, the SWAT team, and how SWAT teams used to be almost a measure of last resort, and bordered, in many instances, these SWAT teams were designed to deal with riots. And nowadays, SWAT teams, they've exploded. And many of these SWAT teams are engaging in the most banal and regular law enforcement on misdemeanor drug houses, on misdemeanors, oftentimes clad in military gear and personnel made possible by federal grants and encouraged by a winner-take-all asset forfeiture program, which tends to just repeatedly cause constitutional concerns. So I'm going to get off my box now, but Radley really touches on some very important issues, and hopefully after tonight we'll send a copy of this video and his book to members of the commission to explain just how important Section 28 is in the Third Amendment to our Constitution. Please join.
We want to repeal the Bible too.
Yes, that's right. All right, please join me in welcoming Radley Balko.
Thank you, Matt, and thanks for the Federal Society for inviting me to chat with you all tonight. I'm just going to jump right in. I'm going to show you this video. It's disturbing, as you might see there, especially if you're a dog person, as I am. But let me set it up real quick. This was in Columbia, Missouri, a few years ago, 2011, I believe this raid took place. The police got an anonymous tip that there was drug activity in this house. They did what they call a trash pull, which they can do without a warrant. They found what they described as marijuana residue in the trash, and that was their probable cause for what you're about to see in this video. Oh, I didn't check the volume. Hopefully we're good. I'd encourage you to count how many seconds between when the police announce themselves and you hear the first gunshot. And imagine you're sort of asleep in the back bedroom, and this is happening to you. There's the first gunshot. You're going to see an 8-year-old get shuffled out of the house here in a minute that they weren't aware was in the house. You can stop. I'll spare you the whole video. So they found, ironically enough, marijuana had been decriminalized in Colombia, still is. So they found a small bag of pot in the bedroom, but under Colombia law, it wasn't actually enough to even charge the guy with the misdemeanor. They did find a pipe near the marijuana, which the way the drug laws work, if the pipe had been anywhere else in the house, it would have been perfectly legal, but because they found it near the pot that they couldn't charge him for, they could charge him on a paraphernalia charge for having the pipe. Basically, he got a $250 fine. But what you just saw was the result of basically they found residue in the trash, and that was how they responded to finding residue in the trash. I had heard about this, or I had heard that there was video of this raid. I tried to get it from the police department. I'd heard that they were actually recording their raids for training purposes. And I couldn't get it from them. Finally, the local newspaper in Colombia filed an open records request and threatened to go to court, and they got a copy of the video. I posted the video online. Within about a week, it went viral. I think it now has over 2 million YouTube views. But the reaction from people to the video, I thought, was pretty astounding. I've been writing about this issue for about 7 or 8 years, and people were angry and livid at what they saw in this video. The Columbia Police Department, they had to shut down their phone lines and their email. They got death threats. The video sort of went around the world, basically. And I remember specifically one night, I knew it was going to be on, so I watched. And I remember watching Fox News, and Bill O'Reilly was talking about the video. And he had brought on apparently noted police tactics expert Charles Krauthammer to comment on the video. And Krauthammer said to O'Reilly, he said, you know, don't judge the drug war based on this video. These are just some rogue cops. You know, this is an isolated incident. You know, don't dismiss the drug war because of what you see in this video. And you know, Krauthammer was 100% wrong. In fact, the only thing that's really unusual about this video is the fact that it was recorded and the video was released. Everything from the relatively little probable cause to the fact that it was done at night, the battering ram, shooting the dog, which is almost perfunctory in a lot of these raids, the fact that they didn't know there was a kid in the house, that they did it at night, none of these things are unusual. Raids like the one you just saw happen about 150 times a day in this country. And to me, as somebody who had been covering this for a while, I found the angry reaction to it, sort of encouraging, because it was almost as if, you know, the internet generation at least, was seeing for the first time how the drug war is actually being fought on the ground, and they were not at all happy at what they were seeing. And it has sort of convinced me, I think, this is a very cynical talk I'm going to give tonight, but if there is some hope, I think it is that as people are made more aware of what's going on and what sorts of tactics their police departments are using, people tend to get pretty upset about it on all sides of the political spectrum, actually. And I do find that encouraging. I think a lot of it's just a matter of awareness. Can we launch the PowerPoint, if you wouldn't mind there? So, let's see if this is awesome. All right. So I'm going to give you another quick anecdote to kind of lead off the talk tonight. This is Katherine Johnston. She's a 90.
Shot at the police.
According to them. Well, that was the story initially. So she was a 92-year-old woman, lived in a rough neighborhood in Atlanta. The week of Thanksgiving 2006, there was a narcotics unit from the Atlanta Police Department out in an SUV. They saw a guy walking along the side of the road that they had arrested on drug charges several times before. They jumped out on him, threw him on the ground, put a gun to his head, and we would find out later, planted a bag of marijuana on him, and basically, you know, gave him the routine. You have a long rap sheet, you know it, we know it, tell us where we can find a significant quantity of drugs, or we're going to arrest you again. So he just made up an address, basically, on the spot, and it happened to be Katherine Johnston's address. Now, what's supposed to happen, of course, is the police are supposed to get a confidential informant to do a controlled drug buy from the house. So, they put a wire on him or give him some marked bills, and that's where they get their probable cause then to go get a search warrant and do their raid. The problem was that he had described basically what they later called a career-making drug bust, and they didn't want to risk having the drug supply being moved before they could get there. So they lied. They made up an informant. They fabricated a drug buy, and a process that was supposed to take a few days took a few hours. And so later that afternoon, they raided Katherine Johnston's home. Katherine Johnston woke up to the sound of people breaking into her house. It took them a few minutes to get the bars off her door. When they did, she was standing in the living room, pointing the old rusty revolver she kept next to her bed at the door. The police opened fire and killed her. They initially said that she shot at them first. We later found out that wasn't true. The gun she had wasn't functional. 2 officers were wounded by bullets fired by their fellow officers. They called for 2 ambulances for those officers. They did not call an ambulance for Katherine Johnston. Instead, they handcuffed her and left her to bleed to death on her living room floor while one of them went to her basement to plant a supply of drugs that they claimed they were going to find. Now, at this point, they realize they have to cover their tracks, right? So they have to find an informant who's going to claim to be the informant in the search warrant affidavit. So they go to this guy they've used in the past, and drug informants are fairly shady characters. They tend to be addicts or people who are trying to get their own charges reduced or dismissed. And to this guy's credit, he refused to play along. There's an amazing 911 call, you can still find the audio for online, where he calls 911 from the back of an Atlanta squad car, and the 911 operator answers the phone or answers the call, and he says, "Give me the FBI," which is sort of charmingly naive. And he says, they're trying to make me say I helped kill that old lady, and I don't want any part of that. One of the officers apparently overhears this. He's in the car alone when he makes the call. He freaks out, jumps out of the car, starts running. They start chasing him, and now there's this surreal sort of foot chase going on in downtown Atlanta. Ends up going through a couple businesses. He ends up losing them long enough to get to a phone. He was also working with the ATF at the time as an informant, so he calls his ATF handler, who then sort of swoops in and picks him up, drives him out to the suburbs, puts him up in a hotel, and now we have a federal investigation. What the federal investigation found was that this was rampant in Atlanta, that the lying on the search warrants, the fabrication of drug buys, the cover-ups, this was going on, the wrong door raids, this was happening way too often in Atlanta. And the reason why it was happening is because Atlanta narcotics officers had quotas they had to meet. Each month they had to arrest so many people on drug charges, they had to confiscate a minimum supply of illicit drugs, and their performance reviews, their promotions, their raises were based on them meeting and exceeding these quotas. The Atlanta City Council held hearings where about a dozen more people came forward and said that they too had been wrongly raided by a narcotics team. The city made a lot of promises, a lot of local politicians got really angry. In the end, not much happened at all. They created a new civilian review board, but within about 3 years, the police union had sued to basically render it impotent. They took away its subpoena power. They took away its ability to... initially, they wanted the civilian review board's recommendations to be permanent, binding, yeah. And after the police union was done, they were merely recommendations, optional. So basically, within a few years, things were back to normal in Atlanta, even after all of this. What the federal investigation didn't conclude, but which I'm going to conclude now, is that what was driving these quotas in the first place, and that's the reason for those quotas is because we have a number of federal programs that make money available to police departments across the country solely for the purpose of drug policing. So if you send your SWAT team out to arrest a suspected murderer or rapist, there's no money involved in that. If you send your SWAT team out to arrest a low-level drug offender, that helps you in your application for this limited pool of federal anti-drug money. So every police department in the country is competing with one another for these anti-drug grants. So now you could argue that Atlanta is the only police department in the country where this is going on, and it just happened to be the only police department that got caught. I would say that that's fairly naive. I would guess that the incentives that are in place in Atlanta are incentives that are in place for the entire country, and I think we're going to see this, that this is going on elsewhere. Did you have a question back there? Oh, okay. All right. I thought you were disagreeing with something I was saying, or okay. All right. So that's how we're sort of going to start the talk. So this is a quote that is commonly attributed to Winston Churchill, although I haven't been able to find any proof that he said it. But this is, I think, it's a Cold War sentiment, and I think it was a way that we sort of distinguished ourselves during the Cold War from East Germany, that, in the United States, the government doesn't send men in black armed men in black to your door in the middle of the night to enforce, basically political crimes. And I would argue that we've not only gotten pretty far away from that sentiment, with the proliferation of the no-knock raid, even the knocking part of that quote has become optional. But I do think it kind of represents or it's a good sort of marker of sort of where we've come from, this idea that we don't do that in this country, and we obviously do. A lot of you probably heard of this phrase, posse comitatus. It's kind of misunderstood, and this is something I learned when I was researching the book. Posse comitatus does not forbid the president or the Congress from using the military for domestic law enforcement. That's commonly how it's used. Actually, what it does is it prevents federal marshals or local officials from enlisting the military for domestic law enforcement purposes. But the president or the Congress can actually, tomorrow, could say, we're going to start using the Army to enforce the drug laws. In fact, during the Reagan administration, they tried to do that. So posse comitatus is a little bit misunderstood, but the general kind of sentiment behind it, and the fact that it is misunderstood in that way, I think illustrates that we do have a tradition in this country, as Matt talked about in his introduction, of keeping the military very separate from domestic policing. And there are lots of good reasons for that. But the most obvious one is that they're just two completely different institutions, right? The military's job is to annihilate a foreign enemy, right? Their job is to kill people and break things. A police officer's job is to protect our rights and to keep the peace. And these are two very, very different functions.
Peace officers is what they're generally called.
Or it used to be called, anyway, yeah. And these are two very different functions, and the fact that politicians tend to think that they're interchangeable because they both carry guns and use force, I think illustrates just how clueless a lot of politicians are. The Troops to Cops program is a great example that the Clinton administration passed, and it was this idea that we should encourage police departments to hire troops returning from overseas, and in general, sort of in theory, that's a good idea, and in fact, former troops actually can make good cops. But the sentiment behind it was that the jobs are sort of, they both carry guns, so that's a perfect job for a returning soldier, is to become a police officer. Ironically, the police chiefs I interviewed for the book say that returning soldiers actually make better police officers because they do have some sense of discipline and sort of structure and accountability that police officers today lack. Which is basically saying that I think police today have in some ways become more militarized than the actual military. So as I mentioned, during the 1980s, there was a move to bring the military in to do domestic policing for the drug war. Both Ronald Reagan and leaders of both parties wanted active duty troops. Basically, they wanted Marines doing drug raids, arresting people, conducting searches. They wanted to bring the military to do this. And they actually, they succeeded in bringing the National Guard in. During the 80s, and actually until today, it started in the 80s, but you literally have black helicopters from the National Guard flying over rural areas of the country looking for pot plants, and then sending troops down, rappelling down to cut up the pot harvests. But in the 80s, they wanted to bring in the military to actually do the policing part, the raids, the arrests, and so forth. And I think this is a sign of a healthy democracy, that the institution that really kind of shot this idea down was the military itself. And this is a quote from Marine Major General Thomas Olsted, who I think was like the number 3 or 4 guy at the Pentagon at the time. And he was brought forth, and basically, I think a lot of members of both parties were sort of surprised. They thought the military was going to be really gung-ho about this idea. And Olsted really kind of set them back, kind of put them in their place. I love this quote. And actually, I think it was his testimony that persuaded them that this was a really bad idea. We've done a really good job in this country of kind of respecting that tradition of keeping the military out of domestic law enforcement. There have been a few instances where I think where we've allowed it to happen. Probably not going to be a popular sentiment given where I am, but Reconstruction is probably the most obvious example, and I would argue that that was probably necessary at the time. But there were also lots of civil unrest, riots, where the military was brought in temporarily to put them down, but then immediately sort of dispatched back to the military once the threat was quelled. So we've done a good job of that. What I argue in the book, and what I'm going to argue tonight, is that where we've dropped the ball is in we've done a good job keeping soldiers from being cops. What we've done a poor job of, and what we've actually encouraged, is for our cops to become more like soldiers. And from the perspective of how cops interact with their communities, with the people they serve, how they approach their jobs, if you take a police officer and you arm him like a soldier and you dress him like a soldier in these battle dress uniforms that police departments are using now, you train him in military tactics, you give him military gear like tanks and armored personnel carriers, and then you send him out on the street and you tell him he's fighting a war, whether it's a war on drugs or crime or terrorism. Of course that's going to have an effect on his mentality and the way he approaches his job and the way he sees the people that he's supposed to be serving. I don't think this is a terribly controversial notion, although a lot of people seem to think it is. But when it comes to the consequences of, what are the consequences of having active duty soldiers do domestic policing, I don't think they're any different than if it's an actual soldier or if it's a police officer who you've basically given all the accoutrements of a soldier.
One more thing too, a lot of local police force, they deem investigations like operations.
Oh yeah.
That kind of military into it.
Oh, absolutely. Operations. There's, and I mean, police have been sort of paramilitary in nature since they were started, right? I mean, they assumed the titles of military officers and ranks. I'll tell you, there's a little anecdote in the book about a assistant police chief in San Diego, Norm Stamper, who tried to demilitarize the San Diego Police Department only in sort of titles. Like he wanted, instead of sergeant and lieutenant, he wanted, manager or supervisor, or which is what they do in the UK, and actually what a lot of federal law enforcement agencies do. And it was like he had, suggested that they disarm. I mean, it was like the visceral response was overwhelming. Even the San Diego newspaper wrote an editorial sort of mocking him for it. Like, how dare you take our military titles away from us? So we're going to play a little game now. This is called Cop or Soldier, just sort of to illustrate how difficult it has become to tell the difference. So I'm going to show you a photo, and you're going to tell me if it's a cop or a soldier. I will say that all these photos are either of U.S. military personnel or of police officers in the United States. I didn't cheat by, taking photos from other countries. So here we go. That's a cop. Soldier. Cop.
Soldiers.
Nope, those are cops. Everybody gets that one wrong.
Cops are better dressed.
Cops.
Are you kidding me? Soldier.
Soldiers.
Cops.
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 It's an Oregon State Trooper. Oddly enough, the way to tell them apart is usually the soldiers are in much better shape. I gotta be careful what I say here. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history now about sort of how we got here. This is a cop, by the way. There are two trends that kind of got us to the point where we are right now, and they both started at about the same time. It's the rise of the SWAT team and the rise of the drug war. I'll talk about the SWAT teams first. So this is Daryl Gates, as many of you probably know, longtime LAPD police chief. Gates basically invented the idea of the SWAT team, and it was a response to, he was basically in charge of LAPD's response to the Watts riots in 1965. And the Watts riots were really unlike any riots we had ever seen in this country before. They weren't isolated to one part of the city. They sort of flared up and spun out and all over the city. There was no kind of arc of activity where things got worse and then started to get better. It sort of went on and sort of up and down for days. And Gates, he was out in the middle of it, and he sort of thought it reminded him of a kind of urban guerrilla warfare. When firefighters would come to put out fires, the rioters would shoot at the firefighters. When paramedics came to rescue people, they would shoot at the paramedics. And so Gates, really thought that the LAPD did not have an adequate response to these kinds of emergency situations. And this, of course, was a time in our country's history when it would have been reasonable to expect more of this kind of civil unrest in the years to come. So Gates got this idea, well, if this is urban guerrilla warfare, we need a more military-like response. So he consulted with some Marines at Camp Pendleton and came up with this idea of having this very elite police team of these highly trained police officers trained in military tactics who would have specialties that they could sort of then dispatch to whatever the emergency was. And the idea was that you would use this overwhelming force and violence to immediately smother a violent situation, a situation where you had lives that were at immediate risk. So you'd have a sniper, you'd have a guy who was good at anti-sniper strategies, you would have a crowd control guy, somebody who could breach doorways, and these would all be specially trained, and they would be sort of the elite of the elite at LAPD. Interestingly, he first brings this idea to Chief William Parker, and Parker just shoots him down flat out. And I find this fascinating. Parker, his reason was he said that this came too close to breaching this historical line that we have between police and the military. Gates continued with the idea sort of on his own until Parker died of an aneurysm a year later, and when the new police chief took over, Gates brings the idea to him, and he gives him the green light, and so now we have our first SWAT team. It was originally, the SWAT moniker originally stood for Special Weapons Assault Teams. Somebody at LAPD told Gates it probably wouldn't be a good idea to have assault in the actual name, so they changed it to Special Weapons and Tactics, and that's how we get the SWAT name. The first SWAT raid occurs in 1969. It's against a Black Panther holdout in Los Angeles, and logistically it was kind of a disaster. In fact, they were lucky that the entire SWAT team wasn't killed the way it was carried out. But the Black Panthers were a legitimate, dangerous, scary organization. This wasn't, I think Fox News sort of wants us to believe that the Black Panthers are the threat to civilization today. This was a different Black Panther group, and they actually did have a body count to their name. And a lot of Americans were legitimately afraid of this group, and here was this kind of heroic police team that was sent in to apprehend these guys. There were hundreds and hundreds of rounds of fire exchanged in the middle of Los Angeles, but it did end with no fatalities. Interestingly, if you know anything about this issue, it's kind of surprising it turned out this way. The Black Panthers who fired back at LAPD were charged with various charges, including attempted murder, and the jury acquitted them on all counts. Basically, they bought the self-defense argument, and that was the Panthers' defense was that this raid occurred first thing in the morning. We had no idea who it was. We had no idea they were police. We were, basically just defending ourselves, and it worked. I'll try using that defense today during a drug raid. In fact, I'm going to talk about what happens when you try to use that defense. The next big raid comes in 1973 against the Symbionese Liberation Army. The SLA was a domestic terrorist organization. I mean, that's all they were. They had kidnapped Patty Hearst, the newspaper heiress, so the whole country was sort of following the story. It was the big tabloid crime story of the day. Patty Hearst had been allegedly brainwashed by the group. She was seen like helping them rob a bank at one point on a security camera. And so when LAPD and FBI said that they had cornered the SLA at this house in Los Angeles, the national media was sort of ready to pounce. And you can actually still find video of reporters sort of ducking under cars as bullets are whizzing by during the SLA shootout. Again, it was a logistical disaster. The house ended up burning down and killing everyone inside, including a lot of children. But again, there was this heroic SWAT team that was confronting this legitimately dangerous terrorist organization. And this time it was nationally televised. And this really sort of injected SWAT into the pop culture and made it kind of a phenomenon. 2 years later, Aaron Spelling produced a SWAT TV drama, which became the most popular show in the country. The theme song went to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. A friend of mine thought it would be funny one time to, actually my ex-girlfriend, to make that my cell phone theme song without telling. But you get, Milton Bradley comes out with the SWAT board game. You get SWAT lunch boxes and Viewmaster sets and jigsaw puzzles. And little, die-cast SWAT mobiles that your son can use to raid his, sister's dollhouse. By the way, I highly recommend the TV show from the 70s. If you like the kind of fast-talking, cheesy sort of cop melodramas from the 60s and 70s, it's wonderful. It's great. Hondo Harrelson is the name of the SWAT commander, which is like the most testosterone-infused name I can possibly think of. So in 1970, there's one SWAT team. By 1975, there are 500. Basically, every significant city in the country has a SWAT team by the mid-70s. But they're mostly used, again, for these emergency-type situations where, again, you're using violence to diffuse an already violent scenario. So the other thing, as I mentioned, that's happening over this period is the rise of the drug war. Nixon, this 1968 campaign was all about crime. If you want to be cynical about it, it was about exploiting fears of crime. If you're a Nixon person, it was about addressing the crime that was gripping our nation. But one of the ideas he came up with, and this is sort of a nugget that I didn't realize until I started researching the book, the no-knock raid was something that sort of was born out of this campaign. It was actually Rockefeller had introduced it in New York, but the no-knock raid was not a tactic that police chiefs were clamoring for. It wasn't something that criminologists were saying police had to have. It was actually the brainchild of a 28-year-old Senate staffer who had been recruited to come up with ideas that Nixon could use in the campaign to sort of tap into fear of crime. So the no-knock raid was something, it wasn't something that sort of organically came out of police work. I mean, I'm sure there were lots of cases where police got to a house and decided to go in without knocking first. The idea of sort of pre-applying for a no-knock warrant was not, it was a political ploy. It was a wedge issue that a Senate staffer had come up with. So in 1970, Nixon gets Congress to pass two no-knock raid bills. One just applies to Washington, D.C. The other applies to federal agents conducting drug investigations across the country. Two very different things, two very different responses to those two bills. In D.C., the police chief at the time, a guy named Jerry Wilson, refused to implement it. He said D.C. didn't need it. He said it was violative of civil liberties. He said it was unnecessary. I interviewed him for the book. He's actually still around, and he talked about the two excuses that you hear for the no-knock raid are that police need to get in because if they announce themselves, the person inside will try to kill them, or because they'll try to dispose of evidence. And his response to both of those I thought was fascinating. He said on the first one, he said, drug dealers get into the drug game to make money. They don't get into the drug game to kill police officers. In fact, most drug dealers know that if you kill a cop, you're going to be lucky to survive the next 4 or 5 seconds. And if you do, you're going to prison for the rest of your life, and you're probably going to be executed if you're in a death penalty state. As for the second point, and this is a point I've made on this issue many times, the destruction of evidence. If you think about what that does, the argument is if police can show a judge that if they knock and announce, the suspect will be able to destroy the drug evidence before they can get inside, basically by flushing it down the toilet. Now, if you think about how that sort of plays out in the real world, that actually gives more protection to a big-time drug dealer who has a huge supply of drugs in his house than it does the small-time dealer who has enough that he can quickly flush down the toilet. So it actually gives more protection to the big guys than to the small guys. Yes?
The flushing of the drugs, doesn't that do what they're trying to do anyway?
Get the drugs off the streets?
Yeah.
That was also Wilson's point. And basically that it's not about destroying the evidence, it's about preserving the conviction. I mean, that's why they want to get in there quickly. And Wilson said flat out, he said, I didn't see why I should put my officers' lives at risk in order to preserve a drug conviction. Well, this is before asset forfeiture, though. Interestingly, so D.C. refuses to implement the no-knock policy, and very interestingly, crime actually goes down in D.C. over the next 3 years while it goes up in the rest of the country. Now, I'm sure that his refusal to implement the no-knock raid is not why crime went down in D.C., but it's interesting that it did. At the federal level, things are very different. These undercover narcotics cops start kicking down doors left and right, taking advantage of this law. They're raiding the wrong house. They're raiding houses without warrants. People are getting killed. The New York Times does an investigation, finds dozens of wrong door raids. AP does its own investigation, finds more. And this is another thing I was not expecting to find in researching the book. Congress actually showed some shame. They called hearings. They brought the victims of these raids forward to testify. And they repealed both no-knock raid laws. Not only that, they passed another law making the federal government liable, financially liable, for any damage done during a wrong door raid. I was floored by that there was actually a time in our history when Congress was capable of admitting it made a mistake and could repeal these laws. Of course, the no-knock raid is going to come back in the 80s, and there's going to be a huge trail of collateral damage and death. And I mean, you can't get anybody in Congress to listen to that, to care about that at this point. But there was a time when it did. So you have these two trends going on, and they're moving parallel to one another, right? These federal raids are being done by guys in street clothes, not SWAT teams. At the same time, you've got the SWAT phenomenon taking off, but the SWAT teams are being reserved for these emergency type situations. So, riots and active shooters and bank robberies and that sort of thing. It isn't until the 80s and the Reagan administration that we see the two trends converge. And now we see SWAT teams primarily used to serve warrants on people suspected of drug crimes. This is a significant shift for a number of reasons. First, when you're using SWAT teams to serve search warrants on people suspected of drug crimes, you're no longer using this kind of violence to diffuse an already violent situation. You're actually creating violence and confrontation where there was none before. Second, you're not using this kind of force against somebody who is actually in the process of committing a violent crime. You're now using it against somebody who's merely suspected of committing a non-violent crime. You're not using SWAT teams to save lives that are at immediate risk. You're using them as an investigative tool to conduct searches of people's homes. And this is a dramatic shift in how this kind of force is used. But of course, we were sort of in the middle of a drug war hysteria at the time. There was a big, dehumanization campaign that the Reagan administration also engaged in with the willing compliance of the media. You have people like William Bennett, who was Reagan's education secretary, later becomes our first official drug czar, who at one point on Larry King floated the idea of publicly beheading drug dealers. Also said, and I'll use the scare quotes that he used, it's a funny kind of war when the enemy is given habeas corpus. So already floating the idea of indefinite detention of people suspected of drug crimes. Reagan himself in 1986 declares illicit drugs a threat to U.S. national security. He likened the drug war to the World War I Battle of Verdun, which, if you know your European history, was this long, protracted battle with about 750,000 casualties over a strip of land that meant nothing to either side, and nobody ended up winning, which I think the metaphor was probably more apt than Reagan realized at the time. You have Daryl Gates, then, who became a leading sort of drug warrior, public advocate, who at one point said that drug users, not even drug dealers, that drug users were guilty of treason and should be taken out in the street and shot. This is a position he walked back a little bit when his son was caught with drugs. Twice, actually. And there are lots of quotes like this in the book, but this is just one example of how this martial rhetoric, this war rhetoric, starts to filter down to local police chiefs, sheriffs, and individual officers. You may have remember a couple years ago, Michael Bloomberg, the mayor of New York, referred to NYPD as the 7th largest army in the world. This betrays a very fundamental misunderstanding of what the role of police officers are. This is the sheriff in Clayton County, Georgia. I love this quote. It says, I liken it to the Vietnam War, referring to the drug war. Hit and miss, there's no clear win. We don't know if we're gaining ground or not. What we want to do, change our strategy. We want to make this more like a Normandy invasion. This is a police officer talking about his constituents, right? The people he's supposed to be serving. And not only is he saying, we need to fight the drug war like a real war, we need to fight it like World War II, not some namby-pamby war like Vietnam. And there you see these quotes all the time where police chiefs and sheriffs and politicians refer to police officers as soldiers or troops. The mayor or the police chief in Milwaukee at one point basically said that he was instructing his police officers that they were to, if they saw anybody openly carrying in Milwaukee, they were to tackle the person, throw them to the ground, and point their guns at them, and then they would determine whether or not the person was carrying legally. Of course, Wisconsin state law, you're allowed to open carry. But when he was asked about this, basically he said, something to the effect of like, the job of my troops is to protect the public. So it shouldn't be at all surprising that a guy who refers to his officers as troops would also have no problem with tackling people and putting guns to their heads and then making them prove that they haven't broken the law. So Reagan does a couple of things that have stuck with us ever since. First thing he does is he instructs the Pentagon to start making surplus military equipment available to police departments across the country. And he does this kind of informally. The policy then gets formalized by Congress in 1997 with an office and a budget. But basically, now you have the Pentagon starting to give tanks, armored personnel carriers, machine guns, helicopters, bayonets for some weird reason. Police departments love bayonets. To police departments across the country. And this is equipment that's designed for use on a battlefield that's being given to domestic police departments for use on American streets and in American neighborhoods. The other thing Reagan does is he starts creating these anti-drug grants. which are these, this federal money solely for the purpose of drug policing. So if you think about this, you're a sheriff or a police chief, right? And you got all this cool gear you just got from the Pentagon, so you start a SWAT team because, why not? And, you're waiting for some bank robbery or active shooter situation to come to your town, and it never does. Now, you can either keep your SWAT team in mothballs and wait for one of those emergency type situations, or you could start sending your SWAT team out on drug raids, which will bring in federal money and actually generate revenue for your police department. So what we see is an explosion both in the number and use of SWAT teams across the country. And there's a criminologist at Eastern Kentucky, Peter Kraska, who in 1999 sent surveys out to police departments across the country and asked them to go back and tell them when they started their SWAT team and then how many times they had used it each year and what they used it for. And what he found was in the late 70s, there were about 300 SWAT deployments per year across the entire country. By the early 80s, we were up to about 3,000, and by 2005, when he did his follow-up study, we were looking at 50,000 SWAT deployments per year in the United States. That was 2005. He hasn't done a survey since, but the trend, if you look at his trend line, the policies that were driving the trend line haven't changed. In fact, they've only strengthened under the current administration. So he estimates we're somewhere between 80 and 100,000 SWAT raids per year in the U.S. now. About 75 to 80% of them he found were to serve search warrants on people suspected of drug crimes, although I think that number is probably a little lower for reasons I'll get into later. Another statistic he found that I still find pretty mind-blowing, in 1980, if you look at towns between 25,000 and 50,000 people, so fairly small towns, in 1980 about 13% of them had a SWAT team. By 2000, 80% of them did, and it's probably safe to assume that just about all of them do now. My hometown, Greenfield, Indiana, has 14,000 people. They have 2 SWAT teams that serve Greenfield, Indiana. And by the way, this Pentagon, this giveaway program, I mean, there's no rhyme or reason to it. You don't have to demonstrate any need for this equipment. In fact, Boone County, Indiana, which is completely landlocked, got an amphibious armored personnel carrier through the Pentagon program. There's a sheriff in Florida that 60 Minutes profiled a few years ago who basically assembled his own Air Force through this program. I mean, it's basically, the police department themselves, they only have to pay for shipping, or they only have to get it there. I know the LA County Sheriff's Office in California actually has 2 18-wheelers on standby just to send out to pick up this gear when it becomes available on the website. There's like a website where you can, as the equipment becomes available. And I mean, you could write just ludicrous profiles of police departments across the country of the crap they're getting through this program. I wrote one. There's a tiny town in Rhode Island that I think they got like 7 Humvees through the program, and a bunch of M16s, and weirdly like 8 snowblowers. So it's all just sort of how good you are at manipulating the program. There's no, you don't have to demonstrate any sort of need. Just a quick couple anecdotes. This is Sheriff Leon Lott in Richland County, South Carolina, and this is his tank. He got this through the Pentagon program. As you can see, it has a 360-degree rotating gun turret that shoots, it's a machine gun that shoots 50 caliber ammunition. Now, the military has restrictions on 50 caliber ammunition. It'll go through 8 or 10 city blocks no matter what's standing in the way. Completely inappropriate for domestic policing. There's no reason you need a 50 caliber machine gun in domestic policing. Well, yeah, that's right, in case there's a coup. When Sheriff Lott got his tank, he put out a press release with this photo at the top of it. He named his tank the Peacemaker, and at the top of the press release included the Bible verse, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they are the children of God." To give you an idea of what kinds of situations Sheriff Lott thinks this sort of force is appropriate, you might remember a few years ago, the Olympic swimmer Michael Phelps was photographed smoking pot at a party at the University of South Carolina. This was Sheriff Lott's jurisdiction. He was personally offended by that photo, and it caused him a lot of personal embarrassment. So he decided he was going to get to the bottom of whoever supplied the pot that was being smoked in that photo. And I'm not kidding you, there's actually a lawsuit against Sheriff Lott right now alleging that, and of course this is half of the lawsuit, so keep that in mind, that he had sent his SWAT team to raid everyone who appears in that photo. So it's these surreal descriptions where basically they say, my client was woken up in the middle of the night to a flash grenade, armed men breaking into his home, roused him from sleep, put a gun to his head, and screamed, not where are the drugs, where are the guns, but what do you know about Michael Phelps? which is amusing and sort of terrifying at the same time, I think. These are just more photos of tanks and other fun gear. Joe Arpaio, the self-proclaimed toughest sheriff in America. This is, that's his tank that he got through the Pentagon program. Yeah, that's his tank. And this is, you might, Steven Seagal right here, the action movie star. So Steven Seagal was deputized by a sheriff's department in Louisiana a few years ago for a reality show. He ended up having to resign after some unfortunate sexual harassment allegations. But he was later deputized by Arpaio, so the show starts again. And to demonstrate, I guess, how tough he is, Arpaio sent Steven Seagal to drive his tank, Arpaio's tank, into this poor guy's living room. The guy was suspected of cockfighting, so raising chickens to fight one another. And for that, they drove a tank into his living room. They ended up euthanizing the chickens and killing the guy's 2 dogs. When Seagal was asked why did you drive a tank into a guy's living room when he was suspected of cockfighting, Seagal responded that he's an animal lover. So that's why that sort of force was necessary. The camouflage always gets me too. I mean, there's no plausible reason for domestic police officers to wear camouflage. I mean, one, when you're conducting a raid, you're not hiding, you're making yourself very known. Second, even if you were, you're not raiding forests, right? You're raiding actual houses. And I mean, the only reason to wear camouflage is, one, to mimic the military, or two, you're getting the stuff directly from the military, and it's actually usually the second. But there's a psychological component to this. I mean, when you dress up like a soldier, you're going to start thinking more like a soldier, or acting like, or seeing yourself as a soldier. The face masks are interesting. There's a conservative commentator, Michael Ledeen, who a few years ago was agitating for war with Iraq, and he wrote on the website Pajamas Media, the sort of conservative blog network. There were a series of photos that had come out of Tehran from Reuters that showed a drug raid in Tehran, cocaine raid by Iranian police, and they're all wearing face masks during the raid. And I remember being amusing because I'd been writing about this issue for a while by then, but I remember being amused by Ledeen because he wrote this blog post about how you're living in a totalitarian country when law enforcement officers cover their faces while they're conducting police operations. And of course, I'd known that, I mean, this happens all the time in the United States, so apparently we should invade the U.S. This is a SWAT team at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. This is the other thing we're seeing are campus SWAT teams now. Ohio State now has one. I would be surprised. I would not. Actually, I think the University of Alabama does have one, because I think they did a series of drug raids a couple years ago. But the justification is always, Columbine, Virginia Tech, we have to be prepared. There's a sociologist at Virginia who studies school violence who's actually crunched the numbers, and he found, his name's Dewey Cornell, he found that the average middle school, high school, or college campus can expect to see a homicide about once every 6,000 years. So the idea that every campus needs a SWAT team to prevent another Virginia Tech is just absurd. The problem, though, is that once you have the SWAT team, you want to use it, and there's plenty of, generally plenty of pot smokers on a campus to keep the SWAT team busy.
When I went to Alabama, they wore blazers and gray slacks.
Yeah, the police did, yeah. I wrote a white paper for the Cato Institute a while back on this issue, and we put together a couple of maps to go with it. These are Google Maps. You can go and click on each of these thumbtacks, and it'll tell you sort of the history and sources about what happened. But each of these red marks actually is a case where a completely innocent person was killed in one of these raids. So this is where they found no drugs. They got the wrong house. In some cases, actually, there were drugs, but there's a child that was caught in the crossfire, or just outright shot by police. But I think there are about 52 of these that I've found now where somebody completely innocent was killed during one of these raids. Yes?
Did all of those end up as lawsuits?
Oh, no. I mean, very few of them did. Most of the time, because police have qualified immunity, it's difficult to even get to court. And mere negligence usually isn't enough. You have to show some sort of malice. So basically, if a police officer makes a mistake and shoots someone during one of these raids, basically they'll get the benefit of the doubt because it's a very volatile situation and there's a very thin margin for error. Now, of course, the police created that situation, and the police people on the receiving end of those raids aren't given that same sort of consideration. But most of the time, I mean, almost never. Usually, if you can generate a lot of media attention, a lot of outrage, a city will settle just sort of out of shame or to sort of make the story go away. But it's really, really difficult to win one of these cases in court. Katherine Johnston's family won a lot of money, but that's because they showed that the police actually tried to frame her after the fact. But if it's just a mistake, they get the wrong house, somebody wrote the wrong address down, you're not going to win in court. You're probably not even going to get to court, actually. So I want to talk about another kind of, I think, kind of significant moment in the story. It comes in 1996 when California legalizes medical marijuana. Up until that point, the justification for using this kind of force had been, drug dealers are very dangerous people. They won't think twice before killing a police officer. They're armed like, third world armies. And there are rebuttals to all those arguments, but at least the government was making those arguments, right? They're saying, we need to use this kind of force because of the threat that we're facing. When California legalizes medical marijuana, and lots of states have since followed suit, the Clinton administration responded by sending federal SWAT teams in to raid these clinics and dispensaries and marijuana grows. Now, at this point, these are all businesses. They're openly operating, they have business licenses. These aren't underground criminal enterprises. The hippie mom and pop couple that's running the pot shop aren't a threat to pull a gun out from under the counter and kill a bunch of federal agents, right? So at this point, the government is basically, openly and without reservation using violence to send a political message, to make a political statement. And that statement is, you're openly flouting federal law, so we're going to bring the boot down on you. But, I don't think people really, a lot of people protested the raids at the time and have since, but I don't think people really realize just how significant, what kind of significance these raids represented. This is not the sort of thing we normally associate with a free society, right? We give the government permission to use force and violence to protect us from violent people, from foreign enemies. But the idea of using violence to make a political statement, that's not something that, I would argue that's not something that's consistent with the principles of a free or democratic society. And there's no question that this is what the government was doing. There was no reason to send SWAT teams into these, cancer convalescent centers where people were smoking pot. There's absolutely no reason for it other than to make an example of it. And of course, we're seeing this continuing today. There have actually been more pot raids in states where it's legal by the Obama administration in 4 years than there were under Bush in 8. And in fact, you're also seeing things like, you may have read, there have been federal raids on Amish farms and co-ops that are selling unpasteurized milk products to people who want to buy unpasteurized milk products. But again, they're openly flouting FDA regulations. Some of them have been warned several times. So you have to send in the SWAT team to basically make an example of these people. Gibson wasn't really a SWAT raid. I think it was misreported in a lot of places as a SWAT raid, but it was an armed raid by the Department of the Interior. I would argue it was heavy-handed, but it wasn't a sort of commando sort of raid. But the Department of Education has a SWAT team. Actually, let me back that up a little bit. I actually wrote an essay for the Wall Street Journal about the Department of Education SWAT team, and the Department of Education demanded a correction from the Wall Street Journal editors, which, to my dismay, they granted them. But what they said is, yes, we have a team of armed law enforcement officials who serve high-risk search warrants with battering rams and shotguns, but we don't call it a SWAT team, therefore we demand a correction. And the reason they said they don't call it a SWAT team is because they don't get tactical training. So this is their defense. Their defense is, we have this team that does everything a SWAT team does, but they're less well trained. Therefore, we're offended that you would call them a SWAT team. And I was disappointed that the Wall Street Journal ran the correction and didn't point out the absurdity of that argument. I'm good for now. So I want to talk about the next kind of significant moment in the story. This has happened in the last 5 or 6 years, where we're now seeing mission creep from these SWAT teams, where they're moving beyond the drug war to the point where they're enforcing regulatory law. They're doing raids on neighborhood poker games. This is in Orlando. The police suspected there was drug activity going on at a lot of these barbershops across the city, but they actually could not get enough evidence to get a search warrant, which of course means they had no evidence at all. So what they did is they called somebody up from the state's occupational licensing board who accompanied the SWAT teams on these raids. And now this is no longer a police action. It was a regulatory inspection to make sure all the barbers were properly licensed to cut hair. They were just enforcing it with the SWAT team. They arrested 37 people. 34 of them were arrested for barbering without a license, which only one person had ever been arrested before in the state of Florida for. They found 2 guys that had some drugs on them that got misdemeanor charges. They had found 1 guy who had enough for a felony charge. I wrote about a case in Virginia where there was a big SWAT raid on a pool hall there. Again, this was a criminal investigation that they didn't have enough evidence for a search warrant, so they called up the Alcohol Beverage Control Board, and this was now officially a liquor inspection. They were making sure that all the bottles were properly labeled and so forth, but they sent a 50-member SWAT team with shotguns and face masks and camouflage to conduct this alcohol inspection. And here's where I think it gets particularly scary. The owner of that bar sued in federal court. In the Federal Court of Appeals, which includes Virginia, somebody just told me this at lunch and I forgot already whatever district that is. But that federal appeals court actually ruled that sending a SWAT team to enforce alcohol regulations is not unreasonable under the Fourth Amendment. Now, to be fair, the district we're in now, the appeals court has actually said that that is an unreasonable use of force under the Fourth Amendment. But the fact that there is a split in the federal appeals courts over whether it's reasonable to use a SWAT team to enforce regulatory law, to me is just astonishing. And we're seeing this over and again. There have been SWAT raids on fraternities and bars where police suspect there's underage drinking going on. There was just a SWAT raid in Texas that was basically a zoning enforcement. This woman was fighting with the city about mowing her grass, and she had like some couches out on in her yard, and she wouldn't clean it up. So they basically sent the SWAT team in to force her to clean it up. In St. Louis County, this is just a few weeks ago, there was a SWAT raid for a white-collar crime of some kind, and it was a search warrant that they were serving for a non-criminal, basically a non-violent crime. It was some sort of business fraud. But they sent the SWAT team, and the local media asked the St. Louis County Police Department, why did you send the SWAT team for this? And the spokesman for the police department actually said, in St. Louis County now, every search warrant is served with a SWAT team, regardless of the crime. So this use of force that was once reserved for riots, for bank robberies, for hostage takings, is now, and it's not just St. Louis County, but in many jurisdictions across the country, now the default use of force anytime police need to serve a search warrant. NASA has its own SWAT team. This poor woman who, her husband, I guess, her husband got like a piece of dust from Neil Armstrong. I guess they were friends, and her husband died, so she tried to sell this piece of moon dust on eBay, which I guess is a violation of federal law. So NASA sent a SWAT team to the local Denny's to arrest her as she was eating breakfast. This is the Department of Education case. In Utah, there's a strike force, a SWAT team, basically just to enforce copyright law, which again is a civil violation, not a criminal violation. This is poker stuff. This is Sal Colosi. Sal was a 38-year-old optometrist in Fairfax County, Virginia. He was at a TGI Fridays with some friends when the Virginia Tech game was on. They were wagering on the game. There also happened to be an undercover police officer with the vice unit of the Fairfax County Police Department there who overheard this. He befriended Colosi, started wagering with him, prodded Colosi to wager increasingly large amounts of money until they wagered $2,000 on a single game, which is enough to trigger the state statute for running a gambling operation. They had no evidence that Colosi was a bookie. Basically, the only evidence was this bet that he had made with this undercover cop. Well, there's that too, yeah. So whatever you think about that particular investigation, I can think of some words to describe it. They could have just sent a couple of uniformed cops to Colosi's house to arrest him. Instead, they decided to send the SWAT team. So Colosi comes out on the porch to meet this guy who he thought was a friend to give him his winnings. The SWAT team pounces. One of the officers, for whatever reason, fires his gun, hits Colosi right square in the heart, and kills him. The police account was that the officer had gotten out of the SUV, the door recoiled, hit his elbow, which caused him to mistakenly fire the gun, which scored a direct hit to Colosi's heart. His family thinks Colosi was reaching into his pocket for a cell phone, which the cop mistook for a gun. That seems like the more plausible explanation to me. But in any case, why are you sending a SWAT team after this guy who was gambling on football? This was in January 2006. 2 months later, of course, it's the NCAA tournament. The Fairfax County Police Department puts out a press release. And I don't think they did this intentionally. I think it was just a case of them being tone deaf. But, I mean, this is a big story in Virginia at the time. But I personally saying, basically saying the headline was something to the effect of, don't enter your office's NCAA tournament pool you can't handle the risk. Right after they had basically executed a guy for gambling on college football games. So child porn is the next thing we're seeing SWAT teams used. And again, this goes back to sending a message. Obviously, people who view child pornography aren't particularly sympathetic, so we're going to throw everything we have at them. The problem is most child porn now is done over the internet, and you can't trace a IP address to a physical address with any real reliability. I mean, you can, but it's easy to make mistakes. The other problem is a lot of people have open wireless connections and they don't password protect. So there have been lots of cases like this one where police have sent the SWAT team to raid someone because their neighbor was using their open wireless connection to look at child porn. So this is a case where they did this, and you can read the description. The guy is obviously terrorized by the SWAT team. They realize they have the wrong house. Now, what do you think the lesson is that the police and the media drew from this case? Maybe we shouldn't use SWAT teams for nonviolent crimes like this. Maybe we should make sure we have the right house before we send the SWAT team. Make sure you password protect your wireless connection. It was his fault that this happened to him. This is the AP's headline on that story. This is one of my favorite stories. This is in rural Virginia. This is a farmer who was basically, getting out of his truck, and the SWAT team pounces. This is another child porn investigation. They had traced the IP address to the wrong physical address. Now, think about this. Like, you're a guy, you're a farmer in Virginia. You're coming home from a long day. You're getting out of your truck. All of a sudden, the SWAT team pounces. They put a gun to your head. You look up, and there is Shaquille O'Neal. So Shaquille O'Neal is another sort of celebrity who's an aspiring law enforcement officer. He's been deputized at police departments across the country, including this one in rural Virginia. And so they decided to take him along on the SWAT raid, and they ended up getting the wrong house, and this guy gets basically swatted by Shaquille O'Neal. It had to be some sort of dream sequence to him. And this is Shaq's response afterward of why they got the wrong house. This was a story about some Tibetan monks who were in the U.S. on a peace mission and overstayed their visas, so naturally you send the SWAT team to apprehend them. I want to talk a little bit about this. So this is the next kind of chapter in this story. In 2000, obviously we have the September 11th attacks in 2001, and we get DHS in 2003. So the Department of Homeland Security responds by sending out these basically checks to police departments across the country to buy new military-grade equipment. Now, the Pentagon program, the Pentagon surplus program I talked about, that was equipment, that stuff already existed, right? It was sitting in a warehouse somewhere, it was surplus. This DHS program is going to buy new equipment. So this has given rise to a cottage industry of companies that have sprung up solely for the purpose of building this new equipment in exchange for these DHS checks. Now, this industry, I'm sure they've already done it. If they haven't, they will soon. They're going to open lobbying offices in DC to make sure these programs continue and expand. The whole system's going to start feeding off of itself, and now you have the police industrial complex, right? The little brother of the military industrial complex, which is going to make it much more difficult to roll any of this back. I have another video I want to show you. The company that makes the Bearcat, which is the most popular armored personnel carrier that these police departments are buying with these grants, it's called Lenco. And I wrote a story a while back about a town in New Hampshire that was actually fighting one of these Bearcats. Their town council wanted to purchase it. They got up in arms. They decided, we don't want this in our town. I talked to a spokesman for Lenco, and he said that these armored personnel carriers were all about officer safety, and anybody who objects obviously doesn't care about the lives of police officers. But he also said something. He said, when a Bearcat shows up at a crime scene, it's more likely to be filled with psychiatrists than it is with a SWAT team. And basically he was saying that basically this is all about de-escalation, right? About talking people down, about conflict resolution. This wasn't about violence. Now I'm going to show you the video that Lenco sends to police departments across the country to market the Bearcat, to encourage them to get one of these DHS grants to buy it. And I'll let you decide for yourself whether this is about de-escalation. So let's pull up the other video. See, it's the other one in the rear. Right here. This is the Columbia one. I opened it up. Yeah, if you go back to my drive there. Bearcat. So this is the video they sent out. Not sure what purpose that serves, but this is my favorite part. This is the unsubtle phallic imagery here is awesome. Cracks me up every time. All right, we can. So that's unlike any psychiatrist I've ever seen. But yeah, I was going to say I want one of those after watching that. Definitely. Yeah, that you can start it right there. That's fine. So the other narrative in the book, and I'll just cover this real quickly because I'm talking for a long time here. But it's protest, and this is the same kind of problems that we're seeing in these other issues is also applied to protest. When I interviewed Jerry Wilson, the former D.C. police chief, during his tenure in D.C., there were actually no protests that turned violent. And of course, this is in the early 70s, and there were lots of protests going on in D.C. And I think it was his approach. He basically said, you have to have the riot squad on hand and nearby in case things get out of hand. But he said he put them on buses and he parked them on side streets so they were out of view. And he would personally show up at protests, and he would bring his officers in uniform in their police blues uniforms, to basically hold the lines against the protesters. But he said something that I thought was pretty profound. He said, if you send cops into a protest expecting violence and confrontation, that's what you're going to get. And after the WTO protests in Seattle in 1999, and the way the Seattle Police Department responded with cops in sort of the full RoboCop gear, and it did erupt into violence, that has become kind of the default response to protest in this country. I interviewed Norm Stamper, the police chief in Seattle, who oversaw that response, and today he calls it the biggest mistake of his career. And he said he's absolutely heartbroken by it because he's seen how this has become, again, the default way that we respond to protests in this country is by, sending the cops out in the full sort of body armor. Just to give you an example, I talk a lot in the book about the mindset problem and how, all this has caused cops to see themselves as soldiers and to see, their job is basically more of a soldier's job than a peace officer's job. This is I'm going to not spoil it for you before I set it up. This is a t-shirt that the Denver Police Union printed up before the DNC convention in 2008 and was actually selling publicly, not just to fellow officers. This is basically a fundraiser before the DNC protests had started. So it says, we get up early to beat the crowds. Actually, I wrote a piece for Huffington Post about this police t-shirt culture, but this is very common. There's a police union in California that printed up a bunch of t-shirts. This is a school police union, so there are enough school police officers in California now that they have their own union. And they printed up a shirt for a fundraiser that showed an 8-year-old kid in a jail cell with bars in front of him. And it said, something California School Police Union, and on the back it said, "You raise them, we cage them." I mean, this is, it's one thing, I understand people who have a, morbid sense of humor because you have a rough job. It's one thing for cops to make these jokes over beers. To openly sort of advertise this, to make t-shirts that you sell to the public and wear in public, I mean, I think it really kind of betrays a significant problem with sort of the mindset that cops approach their jobs with today. I want to talk about this case just because it's sort of amusing before I get to the final anecdote. But so this is a couple in Brooklyn who were raided more than 50 times over I think it was about a 4 or 5 year period. They kept going to the Brooklyn precinct, to the NYPD, and saying, "What's going on, right? Why is it that every few weeks a bunch of cops break into our house and point their guns at us?" And they couldn't get anyone in NYPD to pay attention to them. And it wasn't until they went to the media that NYPD actually looked into what was going on. And basically, I guess what had happened is they installed some sort of new computer system, and when they were testing it out, someone put in a dummy address to test out the search warrant application on the new computer system. When they then implemented the system, they didn't take the dummy address out. So anytime an officer applied for a search warrant and forgot to take the dummy address out and put the real address in, this couple got raided. And, I don't think this is happening all over the country, but the fact that they couldn't get anyone in NYPD to pay attention to the fact that they were getting the hell scared out of them every few weeks, and it wasn't until the media got a hold of this story that NYPD looked into it, I think is pretty telling. The guy who lived there before them had also been raided several times. He had enough smarts to get the hell out. But you know when a real estate agent shows you a house, they're supposed to tell you all the bad things about the house, right? They're obligated to. So I've always sort of wondered if the agent told this couple, every couple weeks a bunch of cops are going to break in and throw you on the floor and point guns at you. But there's a 3-car garage and marble countertops, right? That makes up for everything. So I'll close with the Corey May story here, and I think I close with the story because I think it really kind of poignantly illustrates really just how far we've come in this issue and how comfortable we've become with these kinds of tactics. So Corey May was a 21-year-old guy when all this happened. He and his girlfriend had just moved in together with their 18-month-old daughter, you see here in the picture, in a duplex on Mary Street in Prentiss, Mississippi. This is the day after Christmas 2001 when all this happened. Earlier that day, a drug informant named Randy Gentry had called up Ron Jones, the officer he worked with regularly, and said that there was drug activity going on in the duplex on Mary Street. Allegedly, Gentry then did a controlled buy from the house. Gentry, by the way, a little side note, was described in all of these search warrants as trustworthy and reliable. It's just kind of the catchphrase that they use in all these warrants when they're talking about informants. I later discovered who Gentry was. When Corey's lawyers contacted him, he left a message on one of their machines. It's about, I think, if I remember right, it's about 70 seconds long, and I think he manages to work the N-bomb in about 15 or 16 times in that 70 seconds. He's a drug addict himself. This is the guy who was described over and over again as trustworthy and reliable. Jones assembles a raid team. Corey and his girlfriend lived on one side of the duplex, as I said. On the other side was a guy named Jamie Smith, who already had drug charges pending against him, was a known drug dealer in the area. For whatever reason, they decided to raid both sides of the duplex. Neither Corey nor his girlfriend's name appears anywhere on the search warrant. There is a separate warrant for his side of the duplex. It doesn't appear there was any probable cause for that warrant, but they raided both sides of the duplex. Jamie Smith wakes up. This is 12:30 in the morning. Jamie Smith wakes up to people breaking into his house. He's a drug dealer. He has charges pending against him. Probably good reason for him to think it's the police. He lets them in. He gets arrested without incident. Corey had no prior criminal record, was not a drug dealer. He did have a roach in the house, which would have gotten him a $50 fine under any other circumstance. He wakes up at 12:30 to the sound of people breaking into his house. He is terrified. He moves to the bedroom. He's got a gun that he keeps in the nightstand, takes the gun out, sort of clutches it to his chest, lays down next to his little girl, and sort of hopes the noises will go away. They don't. They move around to the back of the house where the bedroom is. A few seconds later, the door flies open. A figure dressed in black ascends the 3-step entry into the house. Corey fires 3 shots from his gun. One of them gets under the officer's bulletproof vest, pierces his abdomen. He bleeds out and dies on the way to the hospital. The officer Corey shot was Ron Jones, the guy who did the investigation. Jones was the son of the town police chief. Jones was white, Corey was black. This is a part of Mississippi that race was sort of a suffocating part of everyday life, still is. Corey gets arrested. Actually, first he gets pretty severely beaten, then he gets arrested and charged with capital murder, which is the knowing, intentional killing of a police officer. Now, I found Corey's case when I was writing my paper for the Cato Institute on this issue. And I had read enough about these raids at this point to know, when I saw red flags. This story had been covered by the AP, been covered by all the local papers. It actually had been covered on the front page of the New York Times. But the angle that the New York Times reporter took was that the drug war was sort of devastating the rural South and that the government wasn't doing nearly enough to crack down on it. And so when the New York Times reporter came down to Prentiss and covered this story, the raid was basically black drug dealer shoots white cop. Here's another example of how terrible the drug war or the drug trade is. I approached the story as somebody who was skeptical of these tactics, and immediately struck me as, the states. Well, let's talk about Corey's. Here's what Corey says happened, right? He woke up in the middle of the night to people breaking into his home. He was terrified. He had, there's no reason for him to think they were the cops. He's not a drug dealer. Door flies open. He shoots, kills one of them. As soon as he realizes they're police, he surrenders. There are bullets still left in his gun, right? The state's theory was that Corey woke up, looked out the window, saw a raiding team of police officers coming, decided to take them on, armed with only his handgun, waited for them to break in, shot and killed one of them, and then surrendered with bullets still left in the gun. That did not seem very plausible to me. Unless he had a death wish, which a guy who, had just moved in with his girlfriend and their 18-month-old daughter didn't seem to have a death wish, the kind of guy who had a death wish. So the story struck me as something was very wrong about it. I started writing about it on my blog. It kind of went viral on the internet. A young associate at the Covington and Burling law firm in D.C. read about it. He's got a daughter the same age as Corey's daughter, sort of empathized with Corey, brought Covington on board pro bono. I won't bore you with all the procedural details, but basically what happened is a year later, the trial judge threw out the death sentence because of a insufficiency of counsel argument. He had ineffective assistance of counsel. Yeah, sorry, my vocabulary goes first as it gets later. And he had a really terrible attorney. His family hired this woman in Jackson who sort of played up the race angle. They actually would have been better off. The public defender down there was great, and they didn't want a public defender. But a couple years later, then the Mississippi Supreme Court threw out the conviction. Corey was not allowed to argue at his trial that he was defending his daughter's life that night. The Mississippi Supreme Court said he should have been allowed to argue that. So they threw out the conviction. They also granted another one of his complaints that basically his attorney, his bad attorney, I think she had watched too many police TV shows. She immediately moved for a change of venue, thinking that, you killed a cop, we want this as far away from, well, actually what she did is she moved it from a county in Mississippi that was about 70% black to one that was about 80% white, and basically kind of doomed Corey. So the Mississippi Supreme Court also said that if the new trial would be back in Jefferson Davis County, and I think the prosecutors at that point realized that, the best they could hope for at that point was a hung jury. They also used this corrupt medical examiner who Matt mentioned in his introduction to me, who it's sort of mind-boggling. The guy did 1,800 autopsies a year in Mississippi for about 20 years from the basement of the funeral home, all by himself, actually. I mean, the fact that he was being used over and over these cases just blew my mind. But they used him who, as Corey's credibility was basically what was being argued before the jury, and he basically used some junk science to argue that the wounds in the bodies, in the officer's body, the trajectory of the bullets proved that it couldn't have happened the way Corey said it did. And he sounded official, and the jury bought it. In any case, I think the prosecutors realized that they weren't going to get a conviction the second time around. So a couple years ago, they offered Corey a chance to plead guilty to manslaughter, and he would be sentenced to time served. So he'd get to go home to his kids and his family. By that time, he had been in prison for 10 years. And this was a guy who, this is a part of the country where I think not enough kids have good father figures. Corey doted on his kids. He was, he was defending his daughter's life that night. But also, I think this is telling. I remember it being in one of the hearings where the mother of the woman he, got pregnant out of wedlock testified as a character witness at his trial about what a great father he was to her grandkids. And, for all this guy was taken away from his kids for 10 years. I remember, I bring this up because the kind of poignancy of the story occurred to us at the homecoming party that his family threw for him. This was 2 summers ago. So they threw this big party for him, and there's a big soul food buffet, and Corey's taking his kids for rides on 4-wheelers and kind of reconnecting with his daughter and his son. And it's a very happy and joyous occasion, right? Everybody's ecstatic, he's home. And rightly so, but toward the end of the evening, his attorney and I were talking about this, and it sort of struck us as really sort of perverse that this was a happy occasion. Here's a guy who hadn't broken any laws other than maybe recreationally smoking pot from time to time, wasn't doing anything wrong that night, was woken in the middle of the night to the sound of armed men breaking into his home, was put in this unimaginable position where he had to decide whether they were there to kill him or, police who had made a mistake for some reason. Made an error in judgment, which lots of police officers have made in these raids and are never held accountable for. And for that, he was, beaten to within an inch of his life. For the next 4 years, the government tried to kill him. After that, he was transferred to the most violent wing of Parchman Penitentiary, where he served out the rest of his time. They used a corrupt medical examiner to convict him. And at the end of all this, after 10 years of taking away from his kids and his family, his girlfriend sort of moved on with her life, understandably so. He was basically, she did everything she could to sort of take his daughter out of his life while he was in prison. After all of that, the state graciously allows him to plead to a felony, which of course, is going to follow him for the rest of his life. And this was a happy occasion, right? This is one of the happy endings. This is one of the stories that we sort of, point to as like an example where the good guys sort of won in the end. You know, in a just society, or in a society that we responded to this sort of government force in a way that was appropriate, I mean, I think a lot of people would have been outside, you know, courthouses with picket signs after this raid happened, demanding that this guy get compensated for what the state had just put him through. And instead, we've become so comfortable with this idea. We've become so, you know, sort of jaded with the castle doctrine and accustomed to the idea that it doesn't really mean much anymore, that this could happen to this guy, and the fact that after 10 years he gets released, we could see it as a victory. I talk in the book about the term police state. I think it's a little bit overused. As I said at lunch today, if we truly lived in a police state, I would be in jail for writing this book, and you probably would all be arrested for coming to hear me talk tonight. But for people like, you know, Corey May or Katherine Johnston or Sal Colosi, you know, their one interaction with a police officer was life-changing or life-ending. You know, it was all-encompassing. It was their entire world. So if you are one of the people who are unlucky enough to sort of have one of these confrontations, you might as well be living in a police state. If you happen to be somebody who, you know, a black person who lives in one of the sections of New York where black people are getting, you know, you're getting stopped and frisked every 5 or 6 times you leave your house, you know, that isn't all that different from living in an actual police state. So no, you know, I don't think we live in a police state, but I also think it would be a mistake to wait until we actually get to one to start to complain, because of course by then it'll be too late. So,
Katherine, would you mind telling your story? This happened 3 weeks ago in Mobile.
sure.
Just some friends that I know, people I know, it's actually my wife's family. They were at home on Sunday, actually went to bed, because they got a Sunday afternoon nap, and put their daughter down in her bedroom. And he is actually former military, military police. And they both lay down for a nap, and was awoken to their front door being, swung open, and yells and screams to, get down on the floor, get down on the floor. Well, being military police, he had a firearm, and they were very proficient with it. And so as he rolled out of his bed, his first response was to reach under his mattress and get the firearm. But as he rolled, he caught a glimpse of the law enforcement officer's badge or whatever. So as he rolled onto the floor, he actually released the firearm and it stayed underneath the mattress.
Which saved his life.
He could usually went bad, and once they, figured out that they were no threat, they, of course, each want to know what the hell are you doing, basically. And the officer's response was that somebody called in a suicide call, saying that someone at that residence was going to commit suicide.
Yeah.
So they come in, something's wrong.
The natural response. I can't tell you how many suicide calls have ended with the police killing the guy.
And of course, they said that they knocked on the door or whatever, and they said that the door was open, so they came on in. But they swear that they locked the door when they put the dog down for a nap. So.
Well, this is a really scary trend that's sort of come out of all this. Is called people are referring to it as swatting, and the use of SWAT teams has become such a knee-jerk reaction now that if there's somebody you don't like, all you do you call up, you spoof. It's pretty easy to spoof a phone number, or you just use a cell phone and say, "I just shot my wife." Next thing you know, SWAT team's breaking down your enemy's door and possibly putting their lives at risk.
When they went to complain, that's exactly what the officer said.
That somebody had called it in.
You must have made somebody angry, or somebody had to grudge against you because for that to transpire.
I got to tell you, I've tried to get the NRA interested in this issue. If you're a gun rights person, and I am, this should terrify you. If you have a gun in your home and the police mistakenly raid your house and you do what you have a gun in your home to do, you're dead. They're going to kill you. You may kill one of them first, but they're going to kill you. Yeah.
That's like the story in May in Utah. There was a
Matthew.
39-year-old Army vet who I don't think had really a criminal record. I want to say if I read this correctly.
I'm actually writing about this, so I can give you all the details.
It was his ex-girlfriend who called and said he's got 13 marijuana plants. They don't say whether they're on the ceiling or they're this big. In his basement, the SWAT team, they kick in the door, he kills one of them, wounds about 5 of them, and They arrest him. He ends up hanging himself in May of this year.
Yep.
In jail.
This happened in January 2 years ago, yeah. Matthew David Stewart's the guy's name. I'm working on a long article about him. Yeah, he was a former veteran. I mean, he was, you know, he had some problems. He was a little socially awkward, like bought in. He was kind of a 9/11 truther sort. But, you know, he wasn't a violent guy, and basically a bitter ex-girlfriend turned him in for the pot plants he had in his basement, and they raided the place. And that's right. Ended up in a shootout, and, you know, one cop's now dead, and Stewart was going to argue self-defense, and then he lost a motion to have the search warrant declared illegal, and I guess he thought that sort of, you know, made it an uphill battle, and so they found him hanging in his jail cell the day after that motion failed.
Or the Las Vegas, the guy in Costco.
Eric Scott. There's also Jose Guarena in Tempe, Arizona. This is another former veteran. Basically his brother was involved in a lot of criminal stuff. There's no evidence whatsoever that he was involved, but the police had sort of tied him to his brother, and so they raided the place. And this guy was a former Marine, served 2 tours of duty in Iraq. I mean, you know, he wasn't a drug dealer because he was working the graveyard shift at it was like an aluminum mine or something in Tempe, basically back-breaking work. And, you know, they sent the Tempe SWAT team to break into this guy's house in the early in the morning. His son's in the house at the time. His wife's in the house. He puts him in a closet. He grabs his service-issue rifle. They break open the door. He's at the other end of the hallway holding the rifle. They open fire. Actually, what happened was one officer tripped, and another officer, this is their story anyway, claimed that he thought it meant he'd been shot, so they all opened fire. Turned out Guarena, the safety, was still on the gun. I mean, he had actually showed some trigger discipline. The police officers just, you know, opened fire and kill him. I actually showed, this is darkly amusing, I guess. There's video of that, a helmet cam video of that raid, and I actually showed it to a couple guys who not only did raids in Iraq and Afghanistan, but actually trained raid teams to seek out insurgents in Iran and Afghanistan. I showed him that video of that raid, and he said if that raid had been conducted in Afghanistan and Iraq, every member of the SWAT team would have been court-martialed. I mean, basically, he said there's no discipline, there's no training whatsoever. You know, even in Iraq and Afghanistan, he said, you know, most of the time, there's some exceptions, most of the time he said you surround the place, you get on a bullhorn, and you give the person, you know, every opportunity to come out and surrender before you go in, guns blazing. I've actually heard this from other people in the military too, that they agree with me on everything I talk about, but they don't even like the word militarization because they say the military actually treats people better when they raid them than the police do in a lot of these drug raids.
Future projects?
I haven't. I'm working on a book proposal about prosecutors and prosecutorial misconduct and sort of the lack of accountability for prosecutor misconduct. I figure I might as well just get all of law enforcement angry at me about it. Yes, and then I'm sorry.
So now that, like, I mean, you just talked about, you said, you know, if you were a gun owner, you'd be terrified, and like, I mean, I'm a gun owner, and I sleep with my gun next to on my nightstand, and I mean, I live in a townhouse with my brother, so like, I mean, I don't mean to be mean, but like, I'm terrified now. Like, this could happen to anybody.
Well, let me put you a little bit at ease here. I mean, the odds of this happening to you are you know, almost infinitesimal. I mean, you know, this happens 100 to 150 times a day across the entire country, and you know, most of the time they are actual drug dealers that they're raiding. I mean, I think there's probably, if I had to estimate, I mean, you know, police departments don't keep track of their own mistakes. So there's no sort of database of botched raids. But in terms of, like, you know, media reports that I get, I'd say it happens about once a week. They get their own house across the entire country. So the odds are this is never going to happen to you. I mean,
odds are it's a real killer.
Yeah, I would say still defend yourself. I mean, I would say as soon as you.
One person, it's okay to shoot, but if it's a lot of people, it's
well, let me make you even more nervous. I mean, criminals have caught on to this now, and there are lots of stories now about criminals claiming to be and dressing like police in order to get people to let them into their home, basically pretending to be SWAT teams on a raid.
Calm down here.
No, I seriously don't. It's not gonna. It won't happen to you. I mean, I mean, you know, I think it happens enough that we need, you know, that, and it shouldn't happen. But I mean, the odds, you're more likely to be struck by lightning than to be the victim of a wrong-door drug raid.
NRA schools I've been to, and training with the police officers, and most of these police officers are small town police officers. One was from the actual parish, Steve Savant, and worked in.
Oh, yeah.
About what a buffoon that he was. But they share the same mentality, and they would take the same concerns, you know. But the thing about it is, it's hard to not take that money. It's hard not to take that equipment. And it's definitely, if you're a person like myself, I would want to get as much training as possible so those admins are looking for me to get training. And one of the things that we kind of touched on, but the government easily provides that training for Homeland Security.
Actually.
So and also with the FBI. And so that mindset has been developed over the last 20, 25 years through the FBI, through BTF, or through, especially now with Homeland Security.
But they don't give them training on the equipment. I mean, when you get to
No,
tank.
It's like when you get it, you got it.
Yeah. So, I mean, the military, you have to go through hours and hours of training before you can drive a tank. If you're a deputy at, whatever sheriff's department, you get one through this program, you don't have to have any training before you get behind it. And the other thing, just real quickly, we talk about training. We were talking about this at lunch today. I mean, I've talked to a couple of people who train police officers. I'm assuming you train them like firearms handling and that kind of thing. Do you train them on actual use of force or?
I work for a private contractor here locally.
Okay.
And mainly what we just sure everybody's aware that Judge Johnson is part of it.
One thing I want to mention too is 25 years ago the NRA did most of the training.
Absolutely.
Now it's FBI.
Yeah.
And so they're getting a different spiel.
But
creep into that over the years, just because the law enforcement agencies don't have the money to be able to spend whatever it is now. It's $600 plus all the ammunition to send one of your guys to an NRA law enforcement class where the FBI will do it for free.
But the other thing about the training, and I talked to, I think I want to write something on this. I talked to a couple of guys who've done use of force training for years and years, and they are really concerned about the sort of the direction that training is heading. So, for example, they said, one of these guys said, when he started doing this training, the emphasis was on de-escalation, it was on conflict resolution, it was on finding ways to settle disputes without violence. He said basically the overwhelming message you get from these courses now is how to justify the use of force after you've already used it. So now it's about covering up your mistakes, not about how can we try to avoid using violence whenever possible. There's a group called the Force Science Institute that's based out of Minnesota that's probably the biggest training group in the country. They're used by police departments all over the country, and if you actually look through their classes and look through their newsletters, it is all about finding ways to sort of retroactively justify the use of force.
One of the articles is when shot, how to justify shooting somebody in the back.
Oh yeah, well there was one about. And this is so telling. Like there was a cop who a car was rolling backwards toward him very slowly, like basically the person had taken off the brake or whatever, and unknowingly. And the cop responded by opening fire and killing the guy. And the cop was criminally charged, and this Force Science Institute was boasting about the fact that one of their experts testified at the trial about how when you're a police officer in that situation, the car can appear to be going a lot faster than it actually is. Therefore, he was justified, and the guy got acquitted. Now, if you think about this, this is a group that's supposed to be training police officers on how to use the force. You would think that what they would do is they would say, "This is a cautionary tale about why we should train cops, to be able to recognize, when a car is sort of being driven at them versus when it's, rolling at them slowly because it's on an incline." Instead, they spin it as, "Hey, look, we justified this cop killing this guy," and they get more business. Yeah, so it's not a teaching, moment of, here's something that happened, and what can we learn from this so that we don't have to kill people in the future. It's here's how to kill people in the future and get away with it. And I think that's a really sort of unfortunate direction that a lot of this has been moving. A lot of the training has been moving, and it's all sort of done. This isn't. You can get copies of SWAT policy and sort of, the police procedures and that kind of thing. It's much harder to get information on what's being taught at these use of force classes. Yes?
Who would buy all the Bearcats if none of these police departments?
Well, the problem is
there'd be no demand for it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's a government-created market. I mean, it's, yeah. I mean,
Taxes would go down.
I'm a hardcore libertarian, but I get in fights with my former employer at the Reason Foundation about private prisons for the same reason. I mean, I understand maybe they're more efficient, and but I just don't like the idea of having an industry that's created by government whose bottom line rests on perpetual incarceration. And I don't like having an industry created by government whose bottom line rests on keeping police as much like the military, or moving them as much toward the military as possible. I think you were being facetious with your question, yeah. Right.
Did you see the fight in New Hampshire with the people up there trying to stop?
In Keene, yeah. That was where that's how I got that video for the Lenko, was in Keene. And they lost that fight, by the way. They ended up getting one anyway.
The police department's using the argument of why they accept the money, why they accept the material and everything else, because our budget's been cut so much that we gotta do whatever we need to do to get equipment, money, whatever we can get, justify it.
I've seen that argument a few times. The much more likely argument is that we need this stuff because criminals are armed like third world armies today, and like we need to be, it's an arms race and we have to stay ahead. And there's actually little empirical data to support that. If you look at even Justice Department studies on what kinds of guns are used in homicides, it's overwhelmingly small caliber handguns. So the idea that criminals today are armed with grenade launchers and yeah, there's that argument too. Yeah, so there's just not much validity to it. In fact, I mean, the job of police officer is actually as safe as it's been since the early 1960s. You're actually more likely to be murdered just living in Nashville or Atlanta or St. Louis than you are to be murdered while working as a police officer. Now, that's not to say that when cops do get killed, we should not, be upset and compensate their families and treat them, especially if they give their lives, trying to protect someone. But when you continually tell cops every day that your job is one of the most dangerous in the country, which it's not even in the top 30, and you're constantly telling them that every interaction you have with a citizen could be your last, that's going to affect the way they interact with people. They're going to start seeing people as potential threats and not as people they serve and citizens with rights. And so I try to emphasize that it's always hard to make that argument without looking like you're sort of making light of the dangers that police officers face. But it isn't that dangerous of a job these days. I mean, if you're on the SWAT team, yeah, that is dangerous. But that's also because they're being used in the wrong situations far too often. And there's some neighborhoods where it's dangerous. I told this story earlier today at lunch. I'll repeat it real quick. I mean, the mindset problem that I talk about, that cops are seeing themselves as soldiers, I've received some criticism that I'm exaggerating that. And I can tell you, after the book came out, there's a website called Police One, which is where kind of the main activity of police, where police go on the internet to discuss articles and so forth. So they commissioned a series of essays to respond to my book. And one of them was written by the SWAT commander in Sterling Heights, Michigan, David French, I think was his name. And he basically just said, "You're damn right, I'm a soldier." You read it, it's sort of mind-blowing to read it. He talks about, he doesn't refer to his beat, he refers to his sector. He doesn't refer to his job, he refers it to as his tour. He said, at one point he says that police officers today, their job is more dangerous than being an active duty soldier in Afghanistan, which is just preposterous. The numbers aren't even close. And the whole thing is just defending the idea that he is a soldier and he goes to war every day when he puts on his badge. And, this isn't just one guy's opinion. This is one of the essays that this main sort of hub of police activity chose as a representative response, to the arguments I was making in my book. And sort of the punchline to this is that Sterling Heights, Michigan is this very wealthy suburb of Detroit, which 3 times in the last 10 years has been named the safest city in Michigan. So this is the city that this guy sees as a battlefield every day, that he has to sludge through. Just imagine if he actually worked in a dangerous neighborhood. Yeah.
You just said that putting your life on the line every day, isn't what we should be teaching the cops. But I know a lot of people in here have criminal justice degrees, and I do too. But they're still teaching that every day. In the police force, they're still teaching that every day when the police go out on their jobs, like every time they pull a car over, that could be the last thing they do. So, if they're teaching it to the criminal justice students, to the American society, not just people who are
It's a huge problem, yeah. And those, I mean, those traffic stop incidents, I mean, it happens once or twice a year. There are 750,000 active duty police officers in the U.S. I mean, the odds are infinitesimal that it's going to happen to a given cop, but those always make the news. They always get sort of, I mean, I think it's a major problem. I think we need to stop telling cops that, you know, every time you go outside you might be killed. I mean, it's just not true. And I mean, this goes back to, you know, this is, I mean, I'm a member of the media, so I guess I'm partly at fault, but the, you know, it's the if it bleeds, it leads problem. I mean, violent crime in America has been dropping dramatically since 1995. It's at historically low levels. It's actually one of the most amazing stories of the last century is just how far it's dropped and how quickly it's dropped. And nobody's really sure why. Criminologists are fighting over the reasons why. But if you look at opinion polls, Gallup, every year does opinion poll, they ask people, is crime getting better or worse in this country? Every year, at least 60% of the respondents say it's getting worse. And they have been, even as it's been getting better. And the interesting thing is, they ask a couple of different questions. Everybody thinks their own neighborhood has been getting safer, but crime's getting worse everywhere else in the country. And what that tells you is that things are getting safer everywhere. It's just that people are, you know, watching the news and they're just assuming things are getting worse everywhere else. But this is why we get terrible crime policy, because people think things are much, much worse than they actually are. And so they support, you know, sports metaphors, you know, masquerading as crime policy, and these, you know, very kind of simplistic approaches to crime that have gotten us to where we are. I know you were sort of, your question was sort of, what do we do about it? And, you know, I have no idea. I mean, you know, I'm trying to sort of get the word out that, you know, about this. I think that's part of it, is just kind of raising awareness and letting people know that, you know, things aren't as bad as they seem, and like we don't need this sort of hyper-militaristic response, because crime's actually getting better in this country. Now, of course, the response to that will be, well, it's getting better because of all the police militarization, right? And, you know, I guess my response to that is, one, it's a convenient way to frame the argument, because if you frame it that way, if crime's getting worse, you can say, well, see, we need to get tougher and we need more of this stuff. If it's getting better, you can say, see, all the stuff you gave us is working, we need more of it. You know, it's a way of framing the issue where you win either way, which is kind of a common approach. Yeah, I mean, it's the same approach to the war on terror. You know, we haven't had a terrorist attack, therefore all this stuff is working. If we have another terrorist attack, we need a lot more stuff. But SWAT teams, as I said, 75 to 80% of these SWAT raids are on people suspected of drug crimes. Drug crimes are the one class of crimes that actually haven't gone down since 1995. So I think you could argue that, you know, the area of crime where this sort of thing is most directed really hasn't gone down at all, which I think is a good argument that it's not particularly effective. And, you know, I don't think you can find a criminologist in the country who would try to argue that police militarization is why crime has gone down. I mean, there are lots of, you know, broken windows theory is, you know, people support that idea. Some people support the idea of just having more cops is good, which I think there's a lot of support for. Different policing strategies may have contributed to it, but I don't think you can find a criminologist anywhere in the country that would say, you know, SWAT teams and having our cops act more like soldiers is the reason why crime has gone down. I've talked your ear off, so I'm getting tired too, so thank you for having me, guys. I really appreciate it.
All right, next month we'll be hosting Ilya Shapiro, a senior fellow in constitutional studies from the Cato Institute. He'll be discussing the recent Alabama case that was argued last week in the United States Supreme Court on campaign finance. It's McCutcheon versus Federal Elections Commission. And the plaintiff is from Birmingham, or from North Alabama. I think it's Birmingham. But Ilya will be coming down. For those of you who have not followed Ilya on Twitter, on Facebook, or on the Cato site, he's a brilliant, brilliant guy. He actually attended oral arguments last week, so he's going to come back and report to us on the case and what he expects to happen. Once again, thank you all for all coming. This has been a fantastic event. Thank you, Radley, for showing up and giving us a wonderful event. Thank you all.